welcome to the deep dive. So today we're taking on a pretty wild combination of topics based on the sources you all sent in.
It's an unusual mix, for sure.
Right. We're starting with forgotten medieval agricultural resistance, basically, plants that fought the system.
And from there, we move to the emotional reality, the hidden world, inside medieval convents.
And then to top it all off, we're jumping way back to antiquity to talk about aphrodisiacs. I mean, plants, nuns, and potions.
Exactly. And it might seem totally random, but there's a really powerful thread that connects them all.
And that's what we're here to pull on. We're looking at how big institutions, feudal systems, the church, Roman social norms.
Right. How they all reacted to things that just wouldn't fit into the plan. Things that were, in a way, too successful or just too human.
This is the story of things that refuse to be contained.
It is, because every system, at its core, creates rules to keep itself stable. And that often means prioritizing control and predictability over, say, individual well-being or even simple convenience.
So when a plant grows too easily, or an emotion gets too strong,
The system has to react. It has to suppress it or relabel it or just erase it from the story.
okay, let's unpack this. And we're starting right at ground level, literally. In the medieval garden, talking about 15 specific plants that the system basically pushed aside.
And the really fascinating part, the core of the argument from these sources, is they didn't vanish because they failed.
They vanished because they succeeded too well.
Precisely. You have to understand, the whole medieval feudal system relied on a few key pillars. Visible labor, fields you could measure, and, maybe most importantly,
Right.
a kind of chronic, low-grade anxiety about the next meal. That anxiety is what justified the Lord's existence. He offered security from chaos, and in return, the peasant offered obedience.
So any plant that quietly chipped away at that dependency was, what, a threat?
It was a systemic threat by its very nature.
Let's start with the plant that I think embodies this whole problem perfectly. It's called purslane. The notes say authorities deeply distrusted because it, and I love this phrase, refused to behave like a proper crop.
It's the perfect description. What it means is that purslane was just ungovernable.
It didn't need the neat rows.
It didn't need anyone to buy seeds or till a specific field for it. It just showed up. It
Okay.
thrived in drought. It didn't care about poor soil. It grew in the cracks between stones.
So places a normal crop would just give up and die.
Exactly. A peasant didn't really sow it. They just noticed it was there, thriving where nothing else could, and they picked it and ate it.
And nutritionally, the source calls it borderline offensive, which in this context is a huge compliment.
It's the highest praise. It was packed with vitamins, minerals, and omega-3 fatty acids. This is at a time when the average peasant diet was incredibly deficient, mostly just starches.
So it was too good. And it was free.
And that's the systemic flaw. It was all about accountability. A lord could measure a field, assess the yield of wheat, and then levy taxes based on that visible labor and output.
But you can't tax a crack in the wall.
You can't. Purslane bypassed everything. It turned roadsides and old stone walls into, well, free pantries.
A peasant who could just go gather purslane isn't a peasant who's going to panic when the Lord's grain harvest has a bad year.
And a calm, non-panicked peasant is a problem. Panic is a tool of control. Desperation keeps people obedient. Purslane reduced desperation.
So what did they do? They couldn't just ban it?
No, it's impossible to ban something that persistent. Instead, they used a much more subtle weapon. They rebranded it. They called it a weed.
Which the source calls an emotional response.
It's a perfect way to put it. It's a linguistic tool. It's a way to convince people that something so useful and freely available must somehow be worthless. You're shaming people away from self-sufficiency.
That is fascinating. The word weed as an instrument of social control.
And that moves us right into the next one, salsify, which was a threat for the opposite reason. Not because it was so visible, but because it was so secretive.
The underground rebel.
Exactly. Above ground, it looked like nothing special. Thin, unimpressive. It wouldn't catch a tax collector's eye.
But underneath, that's where the value was.
Oh.
A long, deep root, safe from everything happening up top. Frost, drought, even armies marching through.
And that's the control issue. How do you assess a harvest you can't see? Officials needed visible effort and measurable results. That's what justified their jobs, their authority.
Right. If a big chunk of a peasant's diet is just quietly growing underground.
Minding its own business, then how can you tax it? How can you threaten to withhold grain from the central storehouse to ensure obedience? You lose your leverage.
Salsify was, in effect, a private safety net.
And the system hates a private safety net. So Salsify was just ignored into obscurity. It was labeled old-fashioned, food for desperate times only. It was a way of discouraging people from admitting that it actually worked perfectly well all the time. Hashtag B, crops that reduced suffering and suspicion.
Okay, so we've got independence as a major threat. But now we get to the crops that were pushed out simply for making life too comfortable.
Yes, and lovage is the prime example here. The source describes it as the multi-talented friend who was deeply resented.
Because it did too much. It was a vegetable, it was a herb for flavor, and it was a medicine.
It made the incredibly bland, repetitive peasant diet gruel day in and day out palatable, and it was a reliable cure for common stomach aches and other minor ailments.
So the comfort problem was that it reduced reliance on the church.
The church, absolutely. Monasteries often had medicine chests and apothecaries. They provided charity, but that charity came with strings attached to spiritual and temporal obedience.
But if you could just chew on a lovage root from your own garden to settle your stomach.
You ask for fewer favors, you require less institutional help. Lovage undermined the entire narrative that life is supposed to be a constant struggle, a struggle that only the hierarchy can help you manage.
And the source even links it to emotional well-being, chasing away melancholy.
Which was seen as dangerous. Happy people, historically, tend to be the ones who ask questions. Content people are less obedient.
So lovage was framed as being too potent, maybe only for medicinal use in small doses, not as a daily food.
Exactly. Control the dose, control the comfort.
Which brings us to another one that disrupted the system. Skirret, described as sweet, starchy, and scandalously reliable.
It was a fantastic food source. It grew sugary roots that were highly palatable, and it tolerated conditions like wet soil or frost that would kill other crops.
But the problem here wasn't just the reliability, it was the labor model.
Yes. Skirret disrupted the very rhythm of feudal labor. You planted it, and then you waited. It required patience, but it didn't demand constant, visible, back-breaking work like grain crops did.
And that visibility of labor was everything.
It was crucial. Feudalism needed crops that kept people busy, tired, and focused on the immediate task. A busy peasant is an obedient peasant.
But Skirret just quietly promised this huge reward of food without all that suffering.
It was an unacceptable business model, as the source puts it, for a system built on suffering. So culturally, it was downgraded. It was framed as being rural, unsophisticated, not modern. It was replaced by crops that required more work, more oversight, and critically failed more dramatically.
Because dramatic failure keeps people anxious and dependent.
Precisely.
Next on the list has a great name. Good King Henry.
Named that way simply because back then people just called useful things good.
And this was very useful. It grew everywhere. Leaves like spinach, shoots like asparagus, even seeds you could grind into a kind of flour.
It was a master of what the source calls liminal spaces.
The edges.
The edges, the corners, the forgotten patches of land next to a manure pile, the places where authority was weakest. You couldn't really regulate it without trying to regulate every square inch of existence.
And again, it had medicinal uses. So it offered independence in two ways, geographically and medically. It was just too accessible.
And so, over time, its reputation was shifted. It went from being a good plant to being an untidy weed. You dismiss its utility, you call it common, and eventually people forget it was ever a primary food source. You erase its threat by erasing its history. Hashtag my shady sea, the cost of being too effective.
Okay, now let's get to the plants that were just too clever, too effective for a system that valued visibility above all, starting with the groundnut.
Another fantastic example of invisibility being a form of rebellion. While all the respectable crops were growing up where you could see them, count them, tax them.
The groundnut was producing these protein-rich tubers underground.
Hidden, protected, and incredibly resilient. It didn't need fertilizer, it could handle drought, it allowed a peasant to grow, harvest, and eat without engaging with any of the taxed infrastructure of grain farming.
That combination of protein and calories, the source says, was dangerous when the goal is keeping a population dependent.
It absolutely was. It reduced panic during grain shortages, and reduced panic leads to calm thinking.
And calm thinking leads to historically inconvenient outcomes, like asking for better terms or leaving.
Exactly. And because it was underground and stored well, it was invisible during inspections. Officials liked crops they could see. Groundnut was dismissed as insignificant, something only the poorest of the poor would eat.
So they attached a social stigma to it.
A powerful stigma of shame. You're not just eating a plant. You're admitting you're a failure within the system.
Let's move to sorrel. Described as Sharp, sour, and unapologetically honest. How could a flavoring plant be a threat?
Because its utility was so profound in a world without refrigeration, that sharp acidity made the monotonous peasant food taste better, yes. But more importantly, it helped mask the flavor of food that was starting to spoil.
So it made slightly spoiled food safer to eat.
Safer and more edible. It reduced food waste and it reduced illness.
And fewer sick, desperate people.
Our less dependent people. This was the foraging problem on a huge scale. Sorrel grew wild everywhere. Peasants could gather it without asking permission, without paying rent. It made that legal gray area of foraging uncomfortably large for the landowners.
So the authorities reframed it as being dangerous. Too sharp, too acidic.
They warned it could make peasants excitable or worse, opinionated. They literally tried to connect basic health and better tasting food to social instability.
That's incredible. Then we have Cardoon, which the source says looked like it had lost an argument with civilization.
It's a great image. It's tall, spiky, aggressively uninviting. But it was a reliable food source in dry, difficult regions where other things failed. From the perspective of a feudal lord, it was just chaos. It didn't grow in neat rows, it looked wild, and it signaled abundance on land that was supposed to be marginal and unproductive.
Which would make the elites uncomfortable. It messes with their maps of value.
Deeply. It unsettled their sense of visible order, so it was much easier to just dismiss it as being coarse and unpleasant than to admit it was reliable enough to challenge the dominance of the taxed grain crops.
Next is Rampion. This one's specialized and thriving on the absolute worst, land rocky, thin soil.
And this gave it a real political edge. Rampion allowed small communities to survive, even thrive, on land that the authorities weren't really watching, land that wasn't worth taxing.
When you can feed yourself on a forgotten hillside, the whole system of controlled farmland starts to look optional.
Exactly. And that idea is so dangerous that it had to be attacked culturally. It's no accident that Rampion later shows up in fairy tales, like Rapunzel. The moral of the story is often about how trying to take something from a wild, marginal space leads to trouble. It's a lesson in knowing your place.
Wow. And that kind of cultural pressure is what did in Alexander's Roots too, right? It was basically the original carrot, but it lacked the right look.
It did the job perfectly well. But carrots responded beautifully to selective breeding. You could make them uniform, bright orange, predictable. You could control the seed stock and measure the yields with precision.
Alexander's Roots, on the other hand, refused to improve on command.
They were just what they were. They were associated with the old ways, the countryside, not with progress and control. And this just shows a clear historical bias. Resilience often loses out to aesthetics, and more importantly, to anything that can be easily standardized and controlled.
Let's talk about the plants that were punished for being too cooperative, like borage.
Borage was just too efficient. It did everything. It attracted pollinators, its leaves were edible and medicinal, and it even improved the soil it grew in. It was basically doing all the things modern sustainable agriculture tries to achieve, but it was doing it quietly, for free.
And its association with happiness, with chasing away melancholy, was a problem.
A huge problem in a system that relied on a certain level of deference and submission. Contentment was viewed with deep suspicion. Relaxed, happy people are not the most pliable workforce.
And what about mallow? The neighbor who somehow survives every crisis.
Mallow was the administrator's nightmare. All of it was edible, all of it was medicinal. It was the ultimate backup plan. It relieved that crucial pressure point of hunger during the lean months.
It turned forgotten patches of land into emergency kitchens.
Right. And since hunger was the system's primary enforcement tool, mallow had to be taken at a serious consideration. So you just dismiss it. It's common, it's boring, it's unworthy of attention. It's a subtle but incredibly effective way to erase its value.
Then you have plants that literally grew outside the lines on the map, like sea kale.
This plant grew on wind-blasted, salty coastlines where nothing else would. It completely bypassed the inland food hierarchy. A lord could control the fields and the barns, but he couldn't control the beach.
Anything that fed people outside the system was a problem.
Inherently ungovernable, so it was framed as being wild, rough, and inferior. You push it to the geographical margins and the cultural margins at the same time.
Second to last, we have the asparagus pea. Too versatile.
It produced edible shoots and pods over a really long season, which helped smooth out the food supply. It reduced shocks and surprises, but its versatility was its downfall.
Why?
Because it didn't fit neatly into the rigid rotational farming systems, which were all designed around the dominance of grain. Predictability, even if it meant less food overall, was preferred because it made taxation and control simpler. The sources suggest history prefers hunger dramatic to quiet sufficiency.
And finally, chickweed, the ultimate branding problem.
The name says it all. It was branded as worthless, food for chickens, even though it's highly nutritious and grew everywhere, filling that seasonal hunger gap in early spring faster than anything else. It was the fast food of the poor. It allowed people to eat without buying, borrowing, or begging. A food that reduces desperation is a lethal threat to a system that weaponizes desperation.
So you just ignore it. You use its name as a warning. Eating this is an admission of social failure. All 15 of these just hammer home that same point.
That when a system puts its own control and maintenance above the well-being of its people, things like efficiency and independence become liabilities that have to be written out of the story.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the need for control didn't stop at the garden gate, trying to manage plants. It went right behind the high stone convent walls, seeking to impose order on human emotion itself.
It's a perfect transition. We're moving from agricultural resilience to emotional resilience, because medieval convents were designed to be these spiritual fortresses, enclosed spaces where life was dictated by prayer, silence, strict schedules, all to eliminate worldly desire.
But the sources are really clear on this crucial piece of context. Most of the women inside weren't there because of some overwhelming spiritual calling.
Not at all. For many, it was a family decision based on cold, hard pragmatism. To avoid splitting up a valuable estate because a convent was cheaper than a marriage dowry, or sometimes just because the family couldn't afford to feed another daughter.
So they walk through that door, and it closes behind them for life, into a vow of celibacy and obedience they might not have even chosen.
And once inside, life was just relentlessly repetitive. Silence was the rule, but silence doesn't erase emotion. If anything, it amplifies it.
Right. All that affection, jealousy, loneliness, curiosity, it has nowhere to go. So it just turns inward on the community itself.
The church built this container that was supposed to get rid of desire, but all it really did was redirect it. Intimacy, especially emotional intimacy, was completely unavoidable in these all-female spaces where they ate, worked, prayed, and slept together.
And this is where the church really struggled. Where does spiritual sisterhood end and something else begin? This is where we get the idea of particular friendships.
That phrase is a huge red flag. It shows up again and again in the official church records and the rules for convents. It describes these intense, exclusive bonds between two nuns.
They'd insist on sitting together, working together, and would get visibly jealous or upset if they were separated.
And the church's concern wasn't just that this was a distraction from prayer, it was an existential threat. They worried these bonds could lead the heart astray, which is a suggestion that the human attachment was becoming more powerful than their devotion to God.
The human connection was competing with the institutional goal.
And you can see how prevalent it was by the rules they made to stop it. Abbesses were ordered to break up these friendships, and they warned against excessive touching, shared beds, whispered conversations after dark, and the secret exchange of gifts.
In a world that denies you any romantic attachment, even a small thing, a private joke, a shared piece of fruit, must have felt like a huge act of rebellion.
A profound act of intimacy. The severity of the warnings proves how common the behavior was.
So since they couldn't talk about these feelings openly, they found another way. They used their literacy. The quiet rebellion of letters.
Many of these nuns were highly educated, and that gave them a powerful, discreet weapon. They became masters of indirect language, of embedding deep emotional meaning inside of what looked like respectful, pious letters.
You'd see phrases about longing for spiritual guidance, or an aching heart, that could easily be read two ways.
Absolutely. We have surviving letters that are just intensely intimate. They talk about unbearable absence and sleepless nights, but they're phrased just carefully enough to give them plausible deniability.
But the authorities weren't fooled.
Not for long. They started complaining that letters from convents sounded more like secular love poetry than spiritual reflections. And so smuggling letters became this whole operation.
Using messengers, servants, even visiting priests, hiding them in baskets of food or sewing them into clothing.
And if they were discovered, those letters were like bombs. They were dangerous evidence that the system was failing, and the punishment for the writers was swift and severe.
This brings us to another huge loophole in the system, the authority of the confessor.
This was such a fraught relationship. You have these women trained their whole lives to obey male religious authority, and they're in a situation where they have to reveal their deepest fears and temptations to a priest.
In private.
In private, the dynamic is inherently intimate. And that vulnerability created this fertile ground for attachment and sometimes for manipulation.
The church records are filled with warnings against excessive familiarity and priests giving inappropriate consolation.
They knew it was a problem. And while not every relationship was coercive, the power imbalance was so extreme that it was very easy for a priest to slowly turn a nun's devotion into a kind of personal dependence.
Maybe even framing their special bond as a sign of divine favor.
It happened, and the rules they made were basically damage control. Priests had to rotate out frequently, they couldn't linger after services. But when a relationship was discovered, the justice was never equal.
The priest would be, quietly reassigned.
Often, yes, sent to another parish. But the nun faced public humiliation, isolation, maybe even being sent to a much stricter convent. Her shame was the spectacle. His was an administrative footnote.
And the ultimate catastrophic proof that this whole system of enclosure was a failure was, of course, the existence of hidden children.
It was rare, but it happened. And a pregnancy inside a convent was undeniable proof of worldly failure. It required a massive, coordinated cover-up.
The whole community had to be involved. Other nuns, the abbess, servants.
Everyone had to participate in the deception. The goal was total erasure of the evidence to protect the convent's reputation, its brand.
So the infants were quietly sent away to families or left at hospitals.
Or, in the darkest cases, simply erased from the record entirely. For the mother, if she was discovered, the punishment was brutal. Expulsion or even lifelong imprisonment within the convent walls. That was the sound of the system's greatest contradiction.
And this idea of the system failing goes right down to the stones and mortar, the structural porosity of the convent itself.
The myth of the perfect, impenetrable wall was absolutely essential to the church's authority.
But the reality was different. You needed back doors for deliveries, you had shared walls with the town next door, you had tunnels for drainage or water.
And all of these were structural loopholes that were quietly exploited for secret meetings or for smuggling things in and out.
But the institution had to maintain the fiction that the walls were perfect.
They had to, because if the walls are perfect, then any scandal is the fault of an individual sinner. If you admit the walls have holes, you're admitting the system itself is flawed. The sources even show that inspectors knew this was a game. Doors would be temporarily bricked up right before a visit to maintain the visual lie.
Which brings us to what happened when the rules were broken. The systems of selective justice. This wasn't just about punishment, was it?
No, it was about performance. The goal was to correct the individual, yes, but more importantly, it was to reassure everyone else that control had been restored. Reputation was always more important than fairness.
The number one tool was isolation, solitary confinement. They liked it because it didn't leave any visible marks for outsiders to see.
A nun would be removed from the community, put in a small cell. The silence and deprivation were framed as spiritual medicine.
But it often led to psychological collapse.
That was, in a way, the point. The nun would return to the community subdued, broken, and a walking warning to everyone else. The system traded her mental health for obedience.
If that didn't work, they used food restriction, bread and water.
This was a visible, humiliating punishment. Hunger is a very effective tool for breaking someone's will. It was physical pressure disguised as a spiritual exercise.
And for punishments that needed to be a public show, there was public penance.
This was all about shame and visibility. Kneeling on the cold stone floor during Mass, wearing special humiliating clothes, performing painful acts in front of everyone.
It reinforced the hierarchy and served as a powerful lesson to the whole community.
And the psychological impact was designed to be permanent.
Then you have permanent enclosure. This was for a nun who couldn't be trusted, but also couldn't be kicked out without causing a huge scandal.
So she was confined to one specific area of the convent for the rest of her life. It was containment, not correction, a kind of social death, neutralizing the problem without the public drama of an expulsion.
And finally, expulsion itself.
The last resort for scandals that just couldn't be hidden, losing the habit, the identity. It was catastrophic. Families often wouldn't take them back.
It was a way for the institution to protect itself.
It was the ultimate maneuver. You shift all the blame onto the individual, throw her out, and declare the institution pure again. It protected the system by sacrificing the person, reinforcing that structural imbalance. The nuns were dependents, but the clergy were assets.
This raises an important question. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it shows that when institutions demand inhuman perfection, they inevitably create these elaborate, severe systems of control designed solely to manage the inevitable failure of human nature.
And that need to manage, control, or even weaponize human nature takes us across the historical divide, all the way back to antiquity. We're now going to dive into a world where desire itself wasn't romantic, but a dangerous, chaotic force that required direct intervention. We're talking about ancient aphrodisiacs.
This is such a huge cultural shift. For us, love is sentimental. But in the ancient world, it was often feared as a kind of chaos, a force that could ruin your life, destroy your reason.
They treated it like an illness. Greek and Roman writers talk about lovesickness as a literal pathology with physical symptoms.
Things like insomnia, obsession, melancholy.
Exactly, and because they saw love as this physical, almost magical force, they believed it required a physical intervention. Aphrodisiacs weren't just for fun, they were strategic tools.
Tools to win affection, sure, but also to shift political alliances or secure power. This was a world of arranged marriages and dangerous affairs.
And this is where the lines get incredibly blurry. Ancient practice didn't really distinguish between medicine, magic, and poison. A powerful substance was just a powerful substance.
Success was measured by the effect, not by the ethics, not by consent.
If you could influence someone's desire, you held power over their fate. It was that simple. Hashtag B. The ingredients of seduction and subversion.
Let's get into some of the ingredients. The most famous and mysterious has to be mandrake.
Mandrakes symbolize this kind of mysterious, almost supernatural desire. And a big part of that was because its root often looks vaguely like a human body.
Which tied into sympathetic magic, the idea that like affects like.
And the mythology around it was just incredibly potent. The legends claimed it would let out a deadly scream when you pulled it from the ground.
A scream that could kill you.
Or drive you insane. Now, whether people believed that literally or not, the elaborate rituals required to harvest it safely just amplified its mystique. If it's that dangerous to get, it must be unbelievably powerful to use.
So once they had it, it was dried, ground up, put in wine. But they knew it was toxic, right?
Oh, yes. Physicians knew it contained potent alkaloids that could cause hallucinations, paralysis, even death. But that just enhanced its reputation.
Because a substance powerful enough to kill must also be powerful enough to seduce.
It blurred that line between love potion and poison completely. Its power was tied to its toxicity. It was desire on the edge of death.
Okay, so if mandrake was all mystery and magic, bull's blood was the opposite. It was about pure, aggressive force.
It symbolized male dominance, strength, fertility. The belief was that consuming it would transfer that uncontrollable power directly to the user.
But again, physicians knew that raw bull's blood was poisonous.
And again, that contradiction just strengthened the belief. A substance that you risked death to use must possess some extreme, almost divine power. It wasn't promising mutual affection, it was promising conquest.
Then we get to the more respectable side of things with oysters.
Oysters were the respectable face of desire. They were sensual without being overtly dangerous. They were linked directly to Aphrodite, born from the sea foam.
And their appearance, the rough shell, the soft interior, was a perfect metaphor.
And they were expensive, so they signaled wealth, leisure, indulgence. They weren't about force, they were about coaxing desire out through comfort and luxury.
They also allowed women to participate in this culture of desire without attracting suspicion.
Exactly. Eating oysters signaled high status, not subversive magic.
And beneath all of this, you had the murky world of actual love magic and elixirs, the underground economy of desire.
This is where you see recipes combining all sorts of symbolic things: ash, hair, bodily fluids, strange herbs, all to create a physical object that held the user's intention.
And these spells weren't usually asking for love, they were demanding compulsion.
They were. The language is all about burning desire, sleepless longing, unbearable need. This kind of magic was often a tool of the powerless, women, enslaved people who had no other way to influence their fate.
So consent really wasn't part of the equation.
The goal was an undeniable effect. Authorities distrusted it, of course, because it undermined the social order. But it thrived because it offered hope to people who had none. #CC, the political price of passion.
So the use of all these things reveals the high political price of passion, and physicians actually gave people cover for this.
They did, by treating desire as a medical problem, an imbalance of the humors.
So a lover wasn't just indulging in passion, they were treating an ailment, seeking balance.
It was the perfect medical justification for actions that might otherwise be seen as socially destructive.
But not everyone believed it. Roman satirists mocked these potions constantly.
Skepticism was definitely there. They were seen as signs of desperation or insecurity. But skepticism never killed the practice because the potions only needed to do one thing: offer hope and signal intent. Whether they actually worked was almost secondary.
But the real issue here was the inequality of risk.
This is the core of it. For an elite Roman man, if his love potion failed, it was an embarrassment. Maybe he lost some money.
But for a woman or an enslaved person,
The risk was existential. Just the accusation of using love magic could destroy her reputation, lead to legal punishment, or justify extreme violence against her.
the same act was seen completely differently depending on who was doing it.
Desire was political. It could influence inheritance, alliances, status, and the tools used to manage it just exposed who in that society could afford to desire freely and who would pay the highest price for it.
So it was all an attempt to gain control over something they saw as terrifyingly unpredictable.
Human emotion itself.
So we've gone from the medieval fields where efficient plants were erased, to the convent walls where affection was controlled, and now to ancient Rome where desire was chemically manipulated.
And what this deep dive shows is this constant historical pattern. When our fundamental human needs for food, for affection, for desire run up against the rigid limits set by institutions,
People find a way.
people find a way, they adapt. Sometimes it's through quiet resilience, like those weeds, and sometimes it's through risky interventions, like forbidden letters and dangerous potions.
In all three of these histories, the power structures are always prioritizing their own maintenance taxation, purity, control over the well-being of individuals.
The plants that succeeded too well were labeled worthless. The women who sought connection were isolated. And ancient desire was manipulated because just leaving it alone was seen as too dangerous to the social order.
It's a powerful lesson that sometimes success itself can be framed as a failure if it threatens the people in charge.
Systems seem to prefer a loud, visible, convenient failure that justifies their existence, rather than a quiet, efficient success that makes them look unnecessary.
So what does this all mean? It seems that history's most powerful forces are often the ones that just refuse to be contained. A plant that keeps growing, an emotion that persists, a desire that demands to be felt. You've seen how medieval authorities dismissed food that made life better and how ancient minds feared love as a kind of chaos.
So consider this. When we look at our own modern systems, our own culture today, what do we label as easy or unnecessary, too common, or too complicated? Is that label really a sign that something has failed? Or could it be a sign of something that's quietly succeeding, just outside the parts of our lives that are easily measured, controlled, and taxed? Think about that resilience you might be overlooking today just because the system gave it a bad name.